Welcome to your Get That Nugget for GCSE English Language. Today we'll be concentrating on giving you a framework to answer Paper 1, Question 3, the structure question. This session is to complement your lessons with your teachers and not to replace them in any way. To start, we'll have a look at the aims of Question 3. So we are looking at analysing the effects of the writer's choice of structural features, and we need to use some subject terminology in order to enhance our answer. It's really important to remember that this is not a language analysis question at all. There should be nothing to do with language choices in your answer. It is just the structural techniques and the effects of those structural techniques. You need to think of this as almost the text as a puzzle. Why are certain things in certain areas, and why would the writer do that for what sort of effects? So the question is exactly the same in every single language paper 1. It is always asking you to look at the whole extract, and it is always asking you how the writer has structured the text to interest you as a reader. This is really important. It's all about the effects that it has on a reader. How are they trying to get your attention? How are they trying to keep you interested? How are they trying to make sure that you enjoy the text that you are reading? The first thing we need to think about is you need to divide the text in almost 3 parts. So the easiest way to think of this question is you need to understand what happens at the beginning, or what's used at the beginning, somewhere in the middle, and then at the end of the text. This is the easiest way to approach this question. The examiners will choose extracts to make sure that everybody is able to answer at least partial questions. So they will make sure that something happens in the beginning, somewhere in the centre of the text, and that it ends in a way that can be spoken about. But it's really important to remember these 3 things. Even if this question overwhelms you, it's actually a very easy question if you look at it this way. You're looking at what happens at the beginning of a text, somewhere in the middle, and then at the end. If you go into the exam thinking those 3 things, this question will be much easier. So when you come to approach the question, you're going to have to be reading through it at least once before this question anyway. So my top tip is the first time you read through this extract, which will be at the beginning of the exam, my tip is, as you read, I would make notes on the side about what's happening, or if you're able to, any ideas about structural features, because it will save you time later on. If you feel like you would like to just focus on the question that you were on at the time and leave that until question 3, of course that is fine. But I would also do that process when you got to this question anyway. It's much easier, so you don't have to keep rereading sections of the text. You've already made yourself a note. So for example, what I mean by that is, I'm not going to read this to you because I know we've been working on it for a few nuggets now, and you do have a copy of it to download if you wish. But as I read through, I would just make a little note about what's happening in that section of the text. I've already said that we're going to focus on beginning, middle and end anyway, so that is what I'm going to focus on now. But I know the first paragraph, it begins with setting, and I know that it creates quite a frightening atmosphere. So not only have I put what's happening, I know what the effect of that is, so that later when I come to write my answer, I've already got what I want in my notes. Then what you do is, once you've done the beginning, you will start to see as you go through the text that something has changed. Usually there's what we call a shift in focus. You will always use that phrase in your answer. There will always be a shift in focus for the reader. Our focus is shifted from one place to another. Somewhere within the text that will happen, and it's a really good phrase to remember for your response. So we begin with setting. We then have direct speech, and we have direct speech of the characters. So if I go back to this, my focus is shifted from the setting and it's shifted to the characters. Further on down, you'll also see there are some more things here. This is actually quite a good text to do with shift and focus, because this is also about setting. So again, my focus is shifted back, and then it goes again to direct speech. In your practice or in your exam, you would probably label each paragraph, but it doesn't really matter for the purpose of this nugget. It also, if you're focusing on just the beginning, middle, end, it might be that you come across a paragraph where you're not quite sure what's used in there, and that's okay. There's no need to panic about that. You already have your beginning, and there'll be something else within the text somewhere that you can use. And then for the purpose of this nugget, we're just going to end the text here, but by the end of the text, we actually almost have like a race between characters where they're both trying to get an end goal. But this, again, is another narrative shift. It also, which is quite common, ends on a cliffhanger. Most extracts will end on a cliffhanger that you're given because you're obviously not given the entire text. And as I said, an examiner will choose an extract that has something that you can talk about. So that's your first stage. You read through the text and you start labelling off sections of the text that have structural things in there. If you're not quite sure about structural features, but you know what paragraphs are about or what the focus is in each section, that's absolutely fine. Make sure you write that down the side so that you've got that there to work with later. What I did say before is that we focus on beginning, middle and end. The middle can be anywhere between the beginning and the end. It doesn't need to be each individual paragraph. You're only really looking for one thing as a base to go into your middle section. So if I went on to pick 3 things, I've already obviously got my beginning and I've already got my end. I would then just need to pick one of these to talk about. As I've already said, shift and focus is really important and it's an easy one to write about. I would write about something where my focus is shifted. So I probably would write about these things here. So I've got my setting, it then shifts to direct speech of the characters, then it goes back to setting, and then I end on a cliffhanger. That's all very good, that's your first stage, but like with most questions, we also need to think about the effects of these things. So we've already mentioned why the setting might, or what the setting might cause an effect for. We've talked about how it's quite a frightening atmosphere. That is what it is, but is there any way we can look at that in terms of effect of the reader? Why has that been slotted there? Remember what I said, it's like a puzzle. Why is that here and not later on? Well, if we're creating a frightening atmosphere, we don't really know why we're frightened or why the atmosphere is frightening. So actually, they're not telling us. So that's what we call withholding information. We've already started our text not knowing what's going to happen. That's the effect. That's why that's there and not later. If our shift and focus is to go to the characters, well, we've met the characters and this actually reveals the character's thoughts. That is a usual effect for direct speech because we hear directly from the characters and we almost get a bit more suspense and tension created because they're also afraid. So that's the effect of the direct speech here. The idea that it then shifts back to setting, what would that effect be? Well, if we think about it logically, we've gone from setting, where it's a frightening atmosphere, withholding information. We then go to characters where it does reveal some things, but creates more tension. And then we're shifted straight back to setting. It almost becomes quite chaotic. Because again, we're not sure what's going to happen to the characters. If this was later on and we had lots more direct speech, it would reveal lots more. But because of where it is, it doesn't, because our focus is shifted back. And then finally, a cliffhanger, a really easy one to write about. With a cliffhanger, we are left with lots of questions. That's what a cliffhanger is. We don't know what's going to happen. So our tension here is created because we're not sure or we're unsure of what's going to happen to the characters. And that's interesting because we're desperate as we read through here. As the pace picks up, as the tension builds, we want some answers. So that's why the structure is interesting, because we're kept not knowing. Now that's quite a lot of information, and obviously a lot of that is specific to this text, but if we just recap the approach to this question, you can apply that to any extract to do this question. So the first thing is, when you read through the extract, on the side, probably on the left-hand side because you get more room in the exam, I would start labelling what you think the focus of the paragraphs are. That's step one. Step two, go back to your notes on what you've labelled, and then right next to it, make some notes, some annotations of what that effect might be. What you can then do is, if you are familiar with the subject terminology of structural features, you can then add that in as your final step. But most importantly, you need to know what's happening in the text, what's been used, and with the effects of that. And please don't forget shift and focus. That's a really good top tip to have, because in every extract there will be at least one shift and focus, and that counts as subject terminology, so it's a good one to do. But remember, we are looking at beginning, middle and end as our base, so that when we come to write our answer, which I will show you about in the next nugget, we are going to write 3 paragraphs, one about the beginning, one about the middle, and one about the end. What you could do is, after you've made your notes, you may want to go to the section and find quotations. But that is something that takes a few minutes, if that, because this is the actual main important part of your answer. So I'm going to leave you with a question. As I said, the question for structure is always exactly the same, no matter what paper. So you could apply this to any extract that you are given. And this question is from the extract Rebecca, which is uploaded for you to use along with the questions from the other nuggets. But remember that approach. You're looking at something that's happening in the beginning, then somewhere in the middle, and then the end. And your first step is you're going to read through the extract and you're going to label on the side what's happening in that paragraph. And you do that throughout. Then you can go back and start annotating what effects that might create on the reader. You are the reader, so whatever effects it creates for you is what you can write. That's a really key thing to remember, that effects are really, really important to write about. Practice this question, do the annotations, do the planning, and if you show your teacher, I'm sure they'd be able to give you some positive feedback about that.